It's Monday, February 17th, 2025. I'm Eric, the host of the Paperback Warrior blog, podcast, and YouTube channel, bringing you episode number 114. This podcast connects smoothly with the paperbackwarrior.com blog and the Paperback Warrior YouTube channel, where you can find hundreds of videos, thousands of book reviews, and an archive housing the prior 113 episodes of this very show. We're dedicated to vintage paperbacks, pulps, comics, and contemporary works that have the same feel and style. It's all free, all the time, but you can donate to help offset my cost at paperbackwarrior.com. If you're on mobile, just scroll down to the bottom, click the desktop version. The top right corner below the A Books advertisement is a link to donate money. If I can rub a few nickels together off of Paperback Warrior, then I might be able to convince my wife I need more and more time dedicated to all things PW. Cheers to superfan donors like James Seeger, Pete Roble, KR Training, David Kowalski, Ida Umphers, Derek Wallace, and Robert Dice. Also cheers to the great author Jarrett Keene for sending me some awesome care packages of books. He recently sent me a paperback novelization of Robot Jocks and the Demon Seed novel by Dean R. Koontz, which is supposed to be really nuts. Today's episode celebrates Black History Month here at Paperback Warrior with a dedicated feature looking at Black authors, or Black characters, that have contributed to genres like detective fiction and crime-noir. I'll examine the careers of the authors, their standout books, and a brief history on Black detective fiction. I'm also reviewing the newest issue of Men's Adventure Quarterly. This one has a UFO and alien theme, and I love that stuff. Lots of vintage mid-20th century stories and articles culled from the Men's Adventure magazines. We've got a lot to get into today. But to kick things off, I wanted to do a new little segment called Review the Reviewer. This idea sparks from my adoration for BookTube and all the great YouTube channels out there discussing books, comics, and even related toys and other nerdiness. I wanted to spotlight one of these every few episodes. So this week's Review the Reviewer spotlights the Michael K. Vaughan channel. I'll preface this segment by explaining the Michael K. Vaughan channel and how it relates to Paperback Warrior's domestic quarters right here at the house. Anytime I'm doing dishes, cooking, folding laundry, in the shower, or out walking, 9 times out of 10, I have this channel playing on my phone. I know, it's weird. It's safe to say he posts about 4 videos per week, which equates to the amount of reviews I'm typically posting at paperbackwarrior.com outside of the weekly video. My family can probably hear his episode introductions in their sleep. It goes something like this. Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Vaughan Manor, where Roger and I are set to bring you the weekly reading report. That's right, the weekly reading report. It goes something like that. Vaughan is a middle-aged guy, typically sporting a vest, tie, button-up shirt, and a classic fedora. He sits or stands in front of a hardback bookshelf, and his unanimated mummy, the aforementioned Roger, fills the screen. While this is an overused statement, it applies in this scenario. Vaughan has forgotten more about Victorian and vintage fiction than I'll ever know. His knowledge on the greats like Lovecraft, Robert E. Howard, Edgar Rice Burroughs, Clark Ashton Smith, Ray Bradbury, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, it's unmatched anywhere. His format is that every Monday he spends about 20 minutes reviewing 2 to 3 vintage books, pulps, or vintage comics. On Wednesdays, he does a comic book review that's also reviewed by Steve Donahue over on his channel. Other videos are about what he's going to read next or updates on his various challenges. His current challenge, which is monumental, is to read 500 books in his collection before he can purchase a new book. Man, the horror! He's been on to that challenge for about a year and a half or so, and he's still ticking away. He has special months dedicated to reading certain types of books, like, for example, Cimmerian September is for Conan stories, or June on the Range is for westerns. There's also generally seasoned themes like Rocket Summer, which is all about science fiction. He reads public domain books that he calls Roger's Cheap Old Book Club, and I believe the origins of the channel stemmed from what he called the Robert E. Howard Show, dedicated to just that author's work. As it has evolved, it quickly spread into other realms. There's nothing special, there's no video packages, just simply Vaughan standing in front of the screen, holding and talking about books. It's simple, it's fascinating, and his level of knowledge is just uncanny. He can recall certain points of his life where he bought or read something like his first Fantastic Four or Thor comic, or where he watched Tarzan movies. Nothing political, nothing with a great deal of social context, just plain old book fun, and man, I love it. Maybe someday I can even interview him. His channel is Michael K. Vaughn 8617. Michael, traditional spelling, the letter K, dot, V as in Victor, A as in Apple, U as in umbrella, G as in girl, H as in Henry, A as in Apple, N as in Nancy, 8617. I encourage you to check him out. All right, so let's get into today's feature with a little warm-up tune. You all know and love this one. I'm going to press play now. As I mentioned in my opener, this feature is a look at key black authors or black characters with an emphasis on the detective genre. Starting with the structure of the African American detective genres, author Stephen F. Soidos theorizes that black writers created their own version of the detective persona. This included traditional genre tropes and the hard-boiled approach, but those black writers created a new image of the detective based on African American needs. The first obvious difference is that they made male and female detectives black and used their blackness as key ingredients in solving the investigation. Second, the detective's identity is directly connected to the community. Quoting from Soto's nonfiction reference book, Blues Detective, a study of African American detective fiction, in contrast to the standard detective persona, the black detective shares a sense of community and family that doesn't exist in the mainstream detective tradition. Black detectives are intimately connected to their surroundings, often involved in family relations, certainly deeply committed to exploring the meaning of blackness in the text, and in some cases, the nature of the text itself. Further in his book, Soidos says that these black detectives outline the color lines as primary in any case or social relation. He states, quote, "A type of special environment is created with these novels that's based on an exclusive set of priorities dealing with a community with its own cultural values. The blues detective, or black detective, creates a different set of priorities than either the classical or the hard-boiled detective. Rather than focusing simply on the crime, the black detective creates a different set of priorities than either the classical or the hard-boiled detective. Rather than focusing simply on the crime and capture of the suspect, black detectives are interested in the political and social atmosphere, often to the exclusion of detection. This social and political atmosphere is inscribed by racial prejudice. The black detectives recognize their own blackness as well as what blackness means to the characters in the text. The black detectives know what it means to be an African American. There's also an illumination in the process of discovery. The black detective represented a complexity of African American cultural signs." End quote. The other differences include black vernaculars like black folk traditions, cuisine, language, music, hoodoo practice, and dance. Each of these vernaculars are a category of expression. They use these to stress the importance of black culture in their text, especially blues and jazz music. Also, most African American writers use the third-person presentation more than the traditional hard-boiled approach in first person. In the book Black Noir, Mystery, Crime, and Suspense Stories by African American Writers, Otto Penzler describes African American mystery fiction as, quote, "Mystery fiction written by black authors is, not surprisingly, often very different from work in that broadly defined genre written by white writers. The early novels and short stories in particular tended to show the detective in a reasonably insular community, trying to solve crimes with black victims and committed in all likelihood by black villains. Little reliance on the outside white world to administer justice." End quote. One of the earliest pioneers is Pauline Hopkins. She lived from 1859 until 1930, and she was a northeastern American born in Portland, Maine, and she passed away in Cambridge, Massachusetts. She was the editor for Colored American magazine. Her first novel was published in 1900 by the Colored Cooperative Publishing Company, a Boston-based publisher. The book is titled Contending Forces, a romance illustrative of Negro life North and South. The book is set 35 years after the Civil War and centers on the injustices suffered by blacks at the hands of whites. But in terms of black detective fiction, her serial novel, Hagar's Daughter, is considered the very first of the genre. It was published in Colored American magazine for 1 year, starting in March of 1901. The book uses typical detective conventions like mysterious births, hidden and mistaken identities, and even includes an assist from the black maid as a type of detective persona. The book also explores issues of class, gender, and race in meaningful ways. The star of the show is the black maid, Venus Johnson, who volunteers to join black detective Henry Smith in searching for a white aristocrat's missing daughter. Venus uses her knowledge of the black community to determine the missing girl's location. Another early pioneer is John Edward Bruce. He was born a slave in Maryland in 1856, and he passed away in New York City in 1924. His career as a writer, historian, and civil rights leader is remarkable for a number of reasons, but for Paperback Warrior fans, he wrote one of the earliest black detectives. A story titled The Black Sleuth was published as a serial in McGirt's magazine between 1907 and 1909. The character's name, I'm probably going to get this wrong, is Sidipe Okakino, who comes to the U.S. to pursue his education in Maine and the American South. The serial follows his student years, his career as a detective in England, and his investigation into the theft of a large diamond. The serial was compiled in book format in 2002 by New England Library of Black Literature. Rudolph Fisher was born in Washington, D.C. in 1897. He died in New York at the young age of 37 in 1964. He grew up in Providence, Rhode Island, studied English and biology at Brown University. He later attended medical school at Howard University, and he was a head researcher at Manhattan's International Hospital. He studied the effects of ultraviolet rays on viruses. He later worked at International Hospital in Harlem in 1927 and as a radiologist with his own X-ray laboratory. The effects of his X-ray studies probably led to his death by stomach cancer, but his experience with the human anatomy and medical education played a big part in his career as a novelist. His mystery, The Conjure Man Dies, was published in 1932. It's about the death of a hoodoo practitioner and the investigation into his murder by a Harlem detective and physician named John Archer. The book was later adapted into a play in 1936. Hughes Allison was an African-American author that lived from 1908 to 1974. He was born in Greenville, North Carolina. He died in New Jersey. He attended college in New Jersey, and he was the first black writer of the Mystery Writers of America. His first published story was in Challenge magazine in 1935. His contribution to this feature is his story Corollary, originally published in the July 1948 issue of Ellery Queen Mystery magazine. He won an honorable mention and a $200 cash prize in the magazine's annual submission contest. It marked the very first African-American author to ever be published in Ellery Queen Mystery magazine. Corollary features a homicide detective named Joe Hill that the author created based on a real-life Newark Police Department detective named Carlton B. Norris. The detective's beat was a fictionalized Newark town called Old Haven. The author would later explain his creation of the character in a letter, and I quote, "Most large cities in the north, and a few in the south, I understand, use Negro plainclothesmen a great deal now and seek out good ones. Practically all prosecutors and district attorneys in northern urban communities have Negro investigators and assistants on their staff today." Unquote. Unfortunately, Allison never appeared in any future issues of Ellery Queen's Mystery magazine, but the Joe Hill character lived on in a short story titled Imposture, published in the 1949 issue of the short-lived Negro Digest. A third Joe Hill story titled Parallax was never finished. It remains at the University of South Carolina's archives. One of the most popular contributors to black detective fiction is Chester Himes. He was born in Missouri in 1909. He died in Spain in 1984. He attended Ohio State University, but was expelled for playing a prank. In 1928, he was arrested for armed robbery. He was sentenced to 25 years of hard labor, but he was able to get out after serving 7. It was in prison when Himes began writing fiction. His first stories appeared in 1931 in the Chicago publication The Bronzeman. In 1934, he was published in Esquire. After prison, he worked briefly in Hollywood, and he wrote 2 novels in the late 1940s. But he became disenchanted with American politics and how they suppressed black authors from experiencing success. He moved to France and was convinced by literary circles to write crime fiction, which Himes initially felt was beneath him. But he eventually authored 10 hard-boiled novels set in the 1950s and early 1960s. These were deemed the Harlem Detective series. 9 of the 10 books starred two characters, Gravedigger and Coffin Ed. Himes himself preferred to call the books domestic novels rather than detective or crime or mystery novels. The first book, For the Love of Imabel, published by Fawcett Gold Medal, was later retitled A Rage in Harlem, and it introduced both characters. In the book Sticking It to the Man, Revolution and Counterculture in Pulp and Popular Fiction, edited by Andrew Nett and Ian McIntyre, Scott Adelberg describes the characters as, quote, "To put it bluntly, these two ace detectives are black cops working in the largest black section of New York, policing primarily blacks, but they serve a white power structure," end quote. He goes on to quote the characters themselves, saying that colored folks didn't respect colored cops. They had to be harsh on criminals, but used criminals to gain victories. They tolerated numbers men, prostitution, con men, and so forth, so they could gain a foothold on the bigger criminal rackets. The books are known for their aggressiveness both men display and the violent nature of the storytelling. New York native John Ball, a white guy, lived from 1911 until 1988. He worked as a newspaper and magazine reporter, a part-time Los Angeles deputy, and a book review columnist for Mike Shane Mystery Magazine. He authored 3 police procedural novels titled Talon, but he's mostly recognized today for his 1965 book In the Heat of the Night. The classic novel inspired the Oscar-winning film adaptation in 1967. He followed the novel with 6 more sequels that are now all collectively referred to as the Virgil Tibbs series. Virgil Tibbs is an African-American homicide detective in Pasadena, California. He was trained in martial arts, including karate, judo, and aikido. He spent 5 years as a patrolman before being promoted to detective. It's hinted in The Heat of the Night that Tibbs may have attended FBI school. He's a polymath, and his favorite literature hero is Sherlock Holmes. Virgil Tibbs was published between 1965 to 1986 in novel format, but there's also 4 short stories featuring the character published in mystery magazines between 1976 and 1987. Chattanooga, Tennessee's Ishmael Scott Reed was born in 1938 and educated at the University of Buffalo, where he later was awarded an honorary doctorate. His novel Yellowback Radio Broke Down was published in 1969, and it's a Western starring the Loup Garou Kid, an African-American cowboy struggling against established religion and cultural oppression. Its title of Yellowback is referencing the traditional yellow covers of the dime westerns. But we're talking about black detectives. That's where his novel Mumbo Jumbo comes in. The book, published in 1972, introduced a private detective named Papa Labas. He's described as wearing a frock coat, opera hat, glasses, and carrying a cane. He's also a hoodoo practitioner. The character reappeared again 2 years later in The Last Days of Louisiana Red. Ernest Tidman was a white author, born in Cleveland in 1928. He's best known for the iconic 1970s African-American detective character, John Shaft. The character first appeared in Shaft, published by Macmillan Press in 1970. Tidman's sequel, Shaft Among the Jews, was published in 1972. Beginning with the series' 3rd installment, Shaft's Big Score, Tidman was aided by 2 ghostwriters, Robert Turner and Philip Rock, to write the remainder of the series. There were 7 total novels. An 8th novel appeared in 2016 titled Shaft's Revenge and was written by David F. Walker. The books made a successful transition to the screen. The series' debut was filmed in 1971 as Shaft, and then again for 4 more sequels. There were 7 Shaft television films that followed between 1973 to 1974. There was also 2 modern Shaft movies, one in 2019 and another a year later. Shaft is a boxer and martial artist that works as a New York City private investigator. James D. Lawrence was born in Detroit in 1918. He used the pseudonyms Victor Appleton to write the boys' paperback adventure series Tom Swift. He contributed to the house name Franklin W. Dixon to pen 5 Hardy Boys books, and he contributed to the house name of Carolyn Keene to write 8 Nancy Drew novels. He fits into our feature in 2 different ways. The first is a comic strip he wrote for the Chicago Tribune Syndicate starring black investigative photographer Friday Foster. This was published between 1970 and 1974. However, the comic strip's success is overshadowed by the film adaptation of the Friday Foster series. In 1975, American International Pictures released Friday Foster with Pam Grier thrust into the title role. The movies have more of a crime fiction feel to them, with a photographer teaming with a private detective named Colt Hawkins. But Lawrence revisited the idea of a black investigator with a series of 4 paperbacks created by Lyle Kenyon Ingle titled Dark Angel. The lead character is Angela Harp, who handles big, multi-million-dollar cases for insurance companies. She was a former New York Police Department cop, graduated from Radcliffe, and even worked the streets at one point as a hooker. These paperbacks were published in 1975 on Pyramid Books, and you'll need to take out a mortgage if you want to buy one of them. Very expensive and very scarce. Paralleling the peak popularity of characters like Shaft and Virgil Tibbs is Easy Rollins, although you don't hear about him as much. The character was created by Walter Mosley, a Los Angeles native. His mother was Jewish, his father African American. He studied at Johnson State College. While working for Mobil Oil, Mosley took a creative writing course that led to a full-time career as a novelist in 1990. Easy Rollins first appeared in 1990 in the novel Devil in a Blue Dress, which is set in 1948. He's a hard-boiled detective, a World War II veteran, originally from Louisiana. After being cut from his job building aircraft, the unemployed Rollins agrees to search for a missing mistress of a wealthy white politician. The novel was a hit, and it was adapted into a film 5 years later with Denzel Washington in the lead role. Mosley wrote 16 total novels starring the black, outside-the-law fixer. Half of the books have the name of a color in their title. Mosley also authored a 3-book series starring African-American mystery solver Fearless Jones. These books are set in the 1950s and are narrated by Jones' partner, private investigator Paris Minton. These 3 books were published between 2001 and 2006. Joseph Perkins Green was born in Spokane, Washington in 1915. He was a musician with work included in several movie soundtracks like The Big Sleep. Green wrote an adult novel in 1965 for Paperback Library titled House of Pleasure. Somehow, Green became involved with a publisher again with a character he created called Richard Spade. The author was once quoted as saying, quote, "Negroes need to have their own heroes," unquote. Richard Spade appears first in the paperback Death of a Blue-Eyed Soul Brother, published in 1970. A month before Ernest Tidman's Shaft was published. Spade's history is that he was raised in Los Angeles, the son of a Pullman Railroad car porter. He's 33, and he's a lecturer at a college in Santa Barbara. He served 2 tours of duty in the Vietnam War, he played football for the San Francisco 49ers, and was involved in an injury that forces plastic surgery. After the surgery, he discovers he's the splitting image of Gary Grant, but just a bit darker. He's irresistible to the ladies, and he serves as a type of trouble fixer. There were 6 Richard Spade novels published between 1970 to 1972. Another hugely successful black detective on both screen and page is Alex Cross. The character was created by best-selling author James Patterson. Cross works as a detective for the Metropolitan Police Department in Washington, D.C. He's a widower and father in the books. He often works for the president or the Secret Service. He's got a Ph.D. in psychology and at one point worked for the FBI. There's 33 total books, 2 novellas, and 3 spin-off books. These were all published between 2007 to 2024. There were 3 films, 2 of which starred Morgan Freeman as the lead character. Currently, there's an Amazon streaming show titled Cross. Joseph Nizzell was a Vietnam War veteran and successful writer for Los Angeles African-American publications like The Wave and Players. He wrote over 60 novels, some using a pseudonym. Using the name Dom Gober, he wrote 4 books about a Los Angeles undercover police officer named James Rhodes. The books published between 1974 through 1976 on Holloway House, a white-owned publisher that marketed to African Americans. Both Nizzell and Holloway House need their own features soon. I need to get to work on that. Ed Lacey, real name Leonard Zinberg, authored over 30 paperback originals between the 1950s and 1960s. His most successful novel is Room to Swing, published in 1957. It introduced Tui Moore, a black detective working in New York City. In Room to Swing, Moore is hired by a television network to keep tabs on a fugitive, but the fugitive dies and everyone's gunning for Moore as the suspect. The Moore character appeared again in 1964's novel Moment of Untruth, changing the location from New York to Mexico. I briefly wanted to mention a few other books that may be of interest to you. Dolores Como authored a 1988 novel titled Cleo Brown, Private Investigator. This fictional Brown character is the daughter of the first black private detective in St. Louis. She's offered $10,000 to investigate the death of a woman named Angel Moon. Barbara Neely wrote murder mysteries starring an African-American amateur detective named Blanche White. There were 4 books in the series, and they were published between 1992 to 2000. Donald Gones is considered the godfather of urban fiction. He was born in Detroit, Michigan in 1936. He joined the Air Force at the age of 15, and he fought in the Korean War. In the military, he became addicted to heroin, which then led to a life of crime. He was sentenced to prison. He would later be shot and killed at his home in 1974. He authored 5 novels of standalone crime fiction, but they don't really fit the parameters of our feature on mystery or detective fiction. I wanted to mention his name, though, because he did play a pivotal role in writing African-American crime fiction. He also wrote the Kenyatta series of 4 books starring a black nationalist crime lord. The same can be said for the Radcliffe series by Roosevelt Mallory. It's 4 books about a black hitman. Again, fits into crime fiction, but doesn't really drill down far enough into mystery or detective realms. There's plenty of other African-American characters and authors that fall into realms like action-adventure, war, spy, and so forth, but I'm going to save those all for another day. The references I used for this feature, that I didn't already name in the feature, was The Case of the Disappearing Black Detective novel by Sarah Weinman from the New Republic webzine and Fiction Mag's Index. All right, so on to my last segment of this episode, and that's a review. We love reviews, right? Believe it or not, Robert Dice and Bill Cunningham are all the way up to issue 11 now of their Men's Adventure Quarterly magazine. They just keep churning these books out, and each one of them is just a real masterpiece in vintage fiction from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. This new issue is available now, and I thankfully have my copy because you know what? I love the whole UFO and alien thing. I've been following that stuff since I was a little kid, watching Unsolved Mysteries on NBC each week, and from watching the old Sightings show on Fox. And of course, I love the X-Files. So I was happy to see that this issue is the UFO issue. In the book's introduction, Bob Dice explains the connection between UFO pop culture and men's adventure magazines, which honestly I didn't even realize until I saw this issue was coming out. Dice explains how he grew up in Dayton, Ohio, home of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, where Project Blue Book was headquartered. Project Blue Book was the government's investigation into UFO sightings. Dice traces the public's interest and awareness of UFOs to magazine format in the spring 1948 issue of Fate. Later, the 1950 issue contains more significant stories on UFOs, specifically authored by Major Donald E. Kehoe, which Dice examines in detail. This issue contains that entire article in its entirety, which is just fascinating. Dice goes on to outline UFO articles that appeared in Real, Man's Magazine, Saga, and Argosy, among others. There are amazing magazine covers of various issues of True Strange, which is an odd men's adventure magazine, with an introduction by Dice for the article, Are They Hiding the Truth About Flying Saucers?, written by Frank Edwards. Gary Levisi, who's an amazing voice of vintage fiction, has an article titled Space Sploitation, which examines the flying saucer phenomenon as it relates to paperbacks published by the likes of Popular Library, Panther, and Fawcett Gold Medal. The Way Out World of Mr. Adaminsky is an article by Douglas Lansford. I think I might have that right. It first appeared in Climax in October 1961. That article is in its entirety in this issue, with an introduction by Dice explaining the history of George Adaminsky, a man who released a photo of a cigar-shaped UFO to the press in 1947. He claimed he saw 184 UFOs fly over California's Palomar Observatory. This book is chock full of UFO articles, including UFO Agents of Terror from an October 1967 issue of Saga, which discusses the government's attempt at silencing people that speak out about UFO phenomenon. Another interesting one is The New Menace of USOs in the November 1974 issue of Mail. This talks about the frequent sightings of UFOs being seen underwater. Popular British paperback collector Jules Burt has an article in this issue about Gary Anderson's UFO TV series. It goes into the history of the show and the extension into paperback fiction, comics, and movies. There's also a gallery of actresses from the show. Plus, this issue's gallery pages captures a lot of beautiful women that have performed in science fiction movies like Forbidden Planet, Devil Girl from Mars, and Tarantula. There's just so much to enjoy in this issue, even if you aren't a UFO fan or believer. The vintage artwork, magazine covers, movie posters, actress pinups. I mean, what's not to like? This is another solid issue and I highly recommend it. And you know what else I highly recommend? For you to come back here in 2 weeks for the next podcast episode. I'm staying true to our roots with another feature on a vintage crime noir author. You don't want to miss it. As always, keep checking paperbackwarrior.com for at least 4 reviews weekly, which includes novels, comics, pulp magazine stories, and anything in between. I'll see you on the next episode. In the meantime, have fun doing whatever it is you're doing. Bye for now.